Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and making sure that you are here on time for our webinar. We have a lot of information, wonderful information, and we know you're anxious to hear it. So I'm going to get us started. I know that we have lots of people registered. There will be more people joining. You'll see them adding on the participant list as we go, but we do want to start on time. I also know that people occasionally try to unmute themselves, thinking that's what you need to do in order to hear the sound, and you don't, in fact. So we automatically will unmute people or mute people if you are unmuted. So please don't be offended. That's purposeful to make sure the background noise is limited, and we only want to hear Michael. Okay, so again, this is a webinar presented by the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. We are a contractor of the California Department of Education, and this is being provided free to you by funding from the California Department of Education. This webinar is the new federal regulations pertaining to significant disproportionality. So hopefully you've joined the right session. Okay, and I'm just going to take a few minutes. I want to make sure that people have a little bit of information about the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. This will be very brief, and I know some of you are regular participants, and so you kind of ignore me for a while. You've heard this many times before. Those of you who are new, welcome, and we hope that you will join in on some of our other materials and resources that we have for you on the issue of disproportionality. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the services we provide, again, through funding through the California Department of Education. We have webinars like this that we do quarterly on various topics tied to disproportionality, and they are always free, and they're always done virtually, so you can conveniently view them. And we also archive them and leave them on our website, so you can view them after the fact or share them with other folks in your district or colleagues that may be interested in the information. We also do community of practice events, typically quarterly. These are with a select group of districts that we work with on significant disproportionality. And again, I know some of you are involved in that, and if you are not and you would like to be and your district is identified as significantly disproportionate, let us know, and we will make sure that you are invited. And I see that my voice sounds choppy, so maybe I can slow down. I'm not sure if it's a phone issue, but I will try to slow down a little bit and hope that improves. Again, there is our website. That's SPPTAP.org, and we have many resources on that website, including the archived webinars that I just described. We also provide ongoing assistance. So if folks have questions and they'd like to contact us, our contact information is available on the website, so you would find it there, as well as we want to make sure that it's on your slides. So the PowerPoint slides were provided today, I believe. Is that correct? So you would have that. I know it's very small on this slide, but also I believe it's at the end of the PowerPoint. Okay. So how to participate. Today in the webinar, you'll notice when Michael begins, we have a few different ways to get interaction from you. Some of that will be asking you to chat, and some people I see are already writing in the chat box, so we will do that throughout the presentation. You can put questions in there or other comments you'd like to make. There will be some polls, so you'll be given information about how to use the polls. And then there also are just some question and answers where you may, in fact, be asked to raise a hand or perhaps just, again, respond quickly in chat to a question. And you are able to write in chat any questions that you might have. We'll be tracking those as we go, and Michael will be responding to your questions. It looks as though still some issues with sound. Can we do okay. All right. I do want to let everybody know that this is being recorded. Again, because we archive them, we want to make sure to have audio recording, and we also record the chat as well as part of that, just so everybody is aware of that, and that's been turned on already. Okay. So there is quite a lot I could say about Michael Yudin, and I'm going to be very brief in introducing him because he has quite a bit of experience, but again, I want to make sure that the most of the time is provided for Michael and what he's going to share with you. So briefly, Michael Yudin worked on behalf of the Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Education for 6 years, serving the Secretary in a number of capacities, including Assistant Secretary for Special Education and Rehabilitative Services and Acting Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education. In that role, he oversaw implementation of IDEA and was the key advisor to the Secretary on policy matters related to education of children with disabilities. And in particular, Michael worked to ensure students with disabilities were held to the highest standards and expectations, to improve post-secondary education and employment opportunities, and to address issues of racial and ethnic disparities in special education. He also previously served as Education Counsel in the U.S. Senate, and Michael is now principal at the Rabin Group, which is a national public affairs and communications firm. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Michael and let him begin what he has to share with us. Thank you so very much for being here, Michael. We are very, very pleased to have you.
Great. Thank you so much, Connie, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about this important set of rules. Keep in mind, I was the Assistant Secretary over at OSERS when we developed these rules, developed the regulations, issued the notice of proposed rulemaking. I've been away from the department for a year, so if you have questions, you should really make sure you reach out to your state contact over at OSEP. But the reason why I'm here is to give you my perspective, to help you understand what we were thinking as we developed the rules, and hopefully give you some clarity and insight as you begin this really important work. The rules were really aimed at promoting equity in special education, addressing these widespread disparities in the treatment of students of color with disabilities. Hopefully it will provide you with some guidance and support as you begin this important work. It's also important to note, I know there are a lot of questions regarding timelines and all, but and I'm happy to walk through that, answer questions have, but it's probably in your better interest to go to the OSEP website. There's a model of a timeline, model timeline that you can use to help guide you through this work. But again, I'm happy to answer any questions regarding timeline, but your best source of information is really to just go to the OSEP website and you'll find it really, really easily. It's a model timeline. So, you know, what I really wanted to do is kind of talk about the development of the regs, and again, hope to provide some clarity to you all. And how I'd like to kind of proceed is there are three things I really want to try to convey. One is, what was the problem that the department was trying to address? The second thing I'd like to convey is how the department sought to address those problems. And third is really the benefit and outcomes expected from the department. So why don't we kind of dig in and get started? What's the problem? What was the problem the department was trying to fix? So the overrepresentation of children of color in special ed has been a national concern for decades. Congress recognized the problem in both the 97 and 2004 reauthorizations of IDEA, explicitly stating that more minority children continue to be served in special ed than would be expected from the percentage of minority students in the general school population. We also know that from a 2012 Department of Education analysis, they found several nationwide examples of disparities across racial and ethnic groups. For example, we know that American Indian Alaska Native students are 60% more likely to be identified for an intellectual disability. We know that Black children are more than twice as likely as other groups to be identified with an intellectual disability. We know that American Indian or Alaska Native students were 90% more likely to be identified as a student with a learning disability. Black students were 50% more likely to be identified as having a learning disability. Hispanic students, 40% more likely to be identified as a student with a learning disability. Black children, more than twice as likely to be identified as disturbance. When children of color are identified as children with disabilities at substantially higher rates than their peers, there's concern that some of these children may have been improperly identified as children with disabilities. Misidentification interferes with a school's ability to provide children with appropriate educational services. So In essence, we need to make sure that the right children are being identified and getting the appropriate services. The over-identification raises concerns of potential inequity in both educational opportunities as well as outcomes. Research shows that over-identification results in children being placed in more restrictive environments and not taught to challenging academic standards. For example, African American, Hispanic, Latino, American Indian, Alaska Native children and English learners have a greater chance of being educated in separate educational settings than do their peers, diminishing the opportunities of children of color to interact with teachers and others within the larger school context. So we see there are these disparities in educational outcomes as well. So we're going to do a little interactive. We're going to take a poll at this moment, and hopefully I can get this technology right. So please, please, please bear with me. We know from NAEP scores, right, the fourth grade NAEP scores, that 17% of white students with disabilities are reading at proficiency. We're going to take a little poll. What do you think those numbers are like for students of color who have disabilities? Okay, why don't you kind of fill that out and we can go from there. So I think we got a good kind of critical mass. Probably about 2/3 said the numbers between 4% and 6%. About a little over a third, or just under a third. That's my math for you. The numbers between 8% and 10%, and a couple thought it was significantly higher. Let's go and see what we got. Again, bear with me, right? So again, we got 17% of students, of white students with disabilities, are scoring at proficiency in reading. The data, the NAEP data, shows that, again, while 17% of white students are reading at proficiency, only 6% of American Indian, Alaska Native students are reading at proficiency, 6% of Hispanic students are reading at proficiency, and 4% of Black students are reading at proficiency. So we see these really significant disparities. It's not just in opportunities, it's not just in where kids are placed in the services they get, but we really see this translating into outcomes. As a result of this significant disproportionality, these wide disparities in opportunities and outcomes, IDA, the statute, requires each state to collect and examine data to determine if significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and its LEAs at school districts in the state in any of the three categories of analysis. Those categories are the identification of children as children with disabilities, which includes the identification of children with a particular impairment, the placement of children with disabilities in particular educational settings, and third, the incidence, duration, and type of disciplinary actions, including suspensions and expulsions. If the state determines that an LEA has significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity, then the state must provide for the review and, if appropriate, the revision of policies, practices, and procedures. It must require any LEA identified with significant disproportionality to reserve 15% of its IDA funds to provide comprehensive, coordinated early intervening services. We sometimes refer to that as CEIS, comprehensive CEIS, coordinated early intervening services to serve children in the LEA, and particularly children in those groups that were significantly over-identified. And it also requires the district to publicly report on the revision of those policies, practices, and procedures. IDA also allows LEAs to voluntarily use up to 15% of their IDA funds to develop and implement CEIS, Coordinated Early Intervening Services, for children in kindergarten through grade 12, with a particular emphasis on children in kindergarten through grade 3, who have not been identified as needing special ed, but who need additional academic and behavioral supports to succeed in the general ed environment. So again, that's a voluntary use of IDA funds to provide those supports to kids who have not yet been identified. So here's a question. Why don't you raise your hand if you think that the IDA, the statute itself, defines significant disproportionality?
In order to raise your, you're going to look for the icon at the top of your Adobe Connect window. It's a little person, and if you click on that, you can tell us whether you feel that IDEA defines significant disproportionality or not, or if it does.
Well, let me answer that for you. It does not. So IDA does not define significant disproportionality. And in fact, when the department was regulating after the 2004 reauthorization, in those 2006 regulations, the department left the matter to the discretion of the states. So since then, since 2006 regs came out, states have adopted different methodologies, and as a result, far fewer LEAs are identified as having significant disproportionality than the disparities in rates of identification, placement, and disciplinary removal across racial and ethnic groups would suggest. So for example, many states use the risk ratio methodology to identify significant disproportionality. Essentially, risk ratio is comparing the risk or the likelihood that children in a particular racial or ethnic group in a district will be identified for special ed, comparing that to the likelihood that children in a comparison group, usually all other children in the district, will be identified. So that's the risk ratio, and many states use that risk ratio methodology. But the risk ratio thresholds vary greatly. So for example, seven states, within their definition of significant disproportionality using the risk ratio methodology, identify a district as having significant disproportionality if a particular racial or ethnic group is 3 times more likely to be identified, placed, or disciplined. 16 states identify significant disproportionality if the racial or ethnic group is 4 times more likely. 7 states identify significant disproportionality if the racial or ethnic group is 5 times more likely. So I see on the chat we're unable to hear. Are folks having problems hearing me?
I think we can hear you. We're getting some attendees letting us know. It sounds like most people are hearing you okay.
Okay.
So we will give folks a phone number to call in if you're listening on the computer.
Okay. Cool. So again, there are these this great variability, these great differences in the likelihood. Again, right, like 7 states say that it's okay. They won't identify a district as having significant disproportionality unless a group, a racial or ethnic group, is 5 times more likely to be identified. As a result of this great variability and often very high thresholds, very few districts are in fact identified. For example, in 2012 and 2013, only 28 states and the districts
We lost your sound, Michael. Can you check your phone? No, we still can't hear you.
No?
Oh, yeah, we can. There we go.
Okay. I didn't do anything. I swear I didn't do anything.
It's okay. You're good.
But you can hear me. Okay. So, as I was saying, 75% of all districts identified, so 75% of all districts identified were located in only 7 states. So let's see if you can predict how many states have identified significant disproportionality in all 3 categories of analysis: identification, placement, and in discipline. So let's take a poll. How many states identified significant disproportionality in all 3 categories? We seem to kind of have a good critical mass. Again, about 2/3 of folks said the answer is 5. About a quarter, 20% said it's 20 states. So again, right, out of all the states, how many states identified significant disproportionality in all 3 categories analysis? And let's go, how do we end the poll? There we go. So the answer is, the answer is 4 states and DC. So the answer is 5. 4 states and DC identified significant disproportionality in all 3 categories of analysis. That is identification, placement, and discipline. I'm going to do another quick little poll. How many districts across the country do you think were identified with significant disproportionality on the basis of race and ethnicity? All right, so we seem to be about little around half think it's about 2%, and the other half think it's either 34% or 76%. Again, the question, how many districts identified? The answer is 2%. In fact, in 2013, a Government Accountability Office report found that states only found 2% of all districts in the country were identified as having significant disproportionality on the basis of race and ethnicity. So of a total of more than 15,000 districts nationwide, only 356 were identified and required to provide comprehensive CIS, right? That's the remedy for addressing significant disproportionality. The GAO found that the discretion that states have in defining significant disproportionality has resulted in a wide range of definitions that provides no assurance that the problem is actually being addressed or identified. Further, the GAO found that, in fact, that the way that some states defined overrepresentation actually made it unlikely that any districts would be identified and thus required to provide those critical early intervening services. To better understand the extent of the racial and ethnic overrepresentation in special ed, and to promote consistency in how states determine which districts are in fact required to provide comprehensive CEIS, the GAO recommended that the department develop a standard approach for defining significant disproportionality to be used by all states. And the department responded accordingly. They were particularly concerned that despite the data collected by the department's Office of Special Ed and the Office for Civil Rights showing significant disparities in the identification, placement, and discipline based on race and ethnicity, many states were not identifying LEAs with large disparities in identification, placement, and discipline, and really therefore depriving a number of children of the remedies articulated in IDA, including the comprehensive CIS for populations who are in fact over-identified. So the department issued the regs to address and reduce significant disproportionality. So we have these new regs that are in place now. And can you raise your hand if you actually know about these regulations? Cool. A good number of you do. Yeah, it's still coming up, right? A good number of folks know about the regs. How about raise your hand if you've actually read the regulations? Is it like 800 pages, 600 pages, something like that? Let me know if you've actually read the regulations. Nice. Okay, not as many, and it's hard. It's incredibly laborious. So in the chat box that we're opening up, maybe you can just tell us what you know about the regs. Give folks a few minutes. Tell us what you know about the regs. Just give folks another minute or so, and some really interesting information, right? Like some folks are saying that they know that CEIS changed and that dollars can now be used, no longer limited to general education, that these funds can be used to support multi-tiered systems of support, that there was modifications to the formula. States still get to set thresholds. Some folks are new to this and don't know much about it at all. Some folks are saying that there's going to be way more identification. Many more districts will be identified. All right. So let's talk about the regs. So the regs are defined, are designed to ensure that states work with school districts so that children with disabilities are properly identified for services, receive the necessary services in the least restrictive environment, and are not disproportionately removed from their educational placements by disciplinary removals. So I kind of like to think about the regs, and I like to think of things in buckets, so forgive me if I talk about it. There are three things I wanted to talk about when we started this. There are kind of three buckets of categories of regs. And this first category of regs is really about establishing a standard methodology that each state must use in its annual determination of whether significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and the districts in the state. The second category or bucket is about clarifying that the required remedies in IDA actually also apply to disciplinary removals, and I'll talk about that as well. And then the third category or bucket of regs that I want to talk about is the required remedies, and that funds reserved for comprehensive CEIS now must be used to identify and address the factors contributing to significant disproportionality and may be used to serve children from age 3 through grade 12 with and without disabilities. So I think folks actually got to really, when they were talking about what they know about it, a lot of folks seem to know a little bit about it, which is fantastic. So we're going to talk about the standard methodology, and that's probably the most complicated, but I'm going to do my best to make it not complicated, make it simple and hopefully enjoyable and informative. So, requiring states to set the standard methodology, this is not about denying special education services, right? We got a lot of concerns that the department got a lot of comments, and they addressed it in their analysis and comments. But this is not about denying special ed services to children who need them. Rather, it's about making sure that children who need special ed services receive them appropriately and in the least restrictive settings. And that children who do not have disabilities and do not need special ed services are not inappropriately identified as such, and that those children receive proper educational supports through the general ed system. The primary goal of the regs was to ensure that the appropriate review of data and examination for significant disproportionality. Again, right, this is really the goal, right, to make sure that there's a meaningful and appropriate review of data and an examination, and accordingly helps states and districts address and reduce significant disproportionality. To accomplish this goal and get a better understanding of the extent of significant disproportionality across the country, the department did not create a new definition of significant disproportionality, nor did it decide for states the point at which specific racial or ethnic overrepresentation becomes significant disproportionality. Under the new regs, states are required to adopt and follow a standard methodology with flexibility to account for state differences and with input from stakeholders and state advisory panels. The state's methodology would be subject to this department's review and enforcement for reasonableness. So the department articulated several benefits of this approach, and they include improved comparability of significant disproportionality determinations across states, increased transparency in how states make determinations of LEAs with significant disproportionality, and improved public comprehension of a finding of significant disproportionality. Under the regs, the states must set a reasonable risk ratio threshold, reasonable minimum cell sizes, reasonable minimum N sizes, and these standards must be based on advice from stakeholders, including state advisory panels, and are subject to monitoring and enforcement for reasonableness by the Secretary. When monitoring for reasonableness, the department would find that the following are presumptively reasonable. Again, this is just some guidance. This is what the department would find reasonable. A minimum cell size no greater than 10, and a minimum N size no greater than 30. The state's not required to identify a district until the LEA, the district, has exceeded the ratio for up to 3 prior consecutive years. So again, there's flexibility there. The state's not required to identify the district until they've exceeded the ratio for up to 3 years. And if they are in fact exceeding the risk ratio, and they can demonstrate reasonable progress in lowering the risk ratio in each of the 2 prior years, then they would not be required to identify that district either. The state must set a standard for measuring reasonable progress if a state uses this flexibility. In developing the standard methodology, the department carefully looked at research, data, and current practice. And this is, I can assure you, we spent years looking at the data, looking at the research, looking at practices across the country to ensure that the regs met the legal standards of the Administrative Procedures Act, that the regulation was reasonable and not arbitrary and capricious. That's the legal standard. The department drew heavily from current state practices to support its approach. Most states already use a version of the risk ratio, a minimum N size or cell size, and a threshold over which LEAs are identified with significant disproportionality, and up to 3 years of data when making an annual determination. States also have flexibility to tailor the standard methodology to the needs of the population. So again, really try to keep in mind the flexibility that states do in fact need to address the concerns in the state. The flexibility includes the ability to set reasonable risk ratio thresholds and reasonable minimum cell sizes and N sizes. And again, all with input from stakeholders, including the state advisory panel. It also includes the choice to use up to 3 years of data before making a determination of significant disproportionality, and the option to not identify districts that exceed the risk ratio threshold but are making reasonable progress in lowering their risk ratios in each of the 2 prior consecutive years. The department provided the flexibility because they believed it was appropriate for states to tailor their implementation of these regs to their unique circumstance, and as they feel necessary to make adjustments. There's nothing in these regs that prohibits states from changing their risk ratio thresholds, their population requirements, or flexibilities if after implementation of the regs, they determine that reasonable adjustments are in fact needed. So while it's possible that more districts may be identified with significant disproportionality as a result of these regs, this outcome is a consequence of rather than the purpose of these regulations. Again, the purpose of these regs is really to increase comparability and transparency in the examination of data and identification of districts with significant disproportionality across states, to ensure that states are more uniform in implementing the statute and implementing IDA. As the GAO report noted in 2013, the flexibility that states were originally given to define significant disproportionality in the absence of this regulation provided no, and this is a quote, provided no assurance that the problem was being appropriately identified across the nation. So the department believed that the regs will improve implementation of IDA, build greater knowledge about the extent of these disparities, and provide additional opportunities for stakeholders to understand and shape how districts are in fact identified with significant disproportionality. Ultimately, the purpose of the regs is to help ensure that districts are appropriately identified. However, many districts that may be, so that the children with disabilities in those districts receive the services that are appropriate to each of them. An LEA found to have significant disproportionality is not a bad actor or is not necessarily out of compliance with IDA. Rather, the significant disproportionality is, among other things, an indication that the policies and the practices and procedures in the district may warrant further attention. I want to talk for a minute about some of the risk factors, right? We heard a lot, the department heard a lot of comments about poverty. There's been some research, and while there are various risk factors associated with while there are various risk factors associated with poverty that may be associated with greater risk of disability among children, those factors, those poverty factors, are by no means a determinative. I will slow down. Those risk factors are by no means determinative of whether a child should be identified as a child with a disability under IDA. Ideally, children exposed to these risk factors are screened for developmental delays and other academic and behavioral challenges so that their needs may be addressed early and appropriately. IDEA requires that the individual needs of children with disabilities, as opposed to their exposure to risk, be central to determining the need for special ed and related services. And even in situations where differential exposure to risk factors contribute to racial disparities in special ed, schools may help to mitigate the effects of these risk factors by screening children early and by providing early and appropriate interventions and support. And this is a major purpose of comprehensive CEIS. And one reason that the department expanded the scope of comprehensive CEIS to include children ages 3 through 5. It's important to remember that even with these regs, states should ensure that their child find procedures are robust and robust enough to appropriately identify all children with disabilities in a timely manner. Each state must have policies and procedures to ensure that all children residing in the state who are in need of special ed and related services are identified and located. All right, so let's stop for a minute and find out what's puzzling you. Jen, there are questions, I'm sure. You want to see if there are a couple of questions we can answer?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start with the beginning. So Debbie Rogers asked earlier, and they're very small districts, the percentages can be skewed with one child moving into the district. Is there any way to address this with the smaller districts?
Yeah, so, you know, again, while addressing the cell sizes, setting the cell sizes and the end sizes really should account for those districts with very, very small populations of students with disabilities.
So, Debbie, if you have any follow-up questions with that, you can add them in chat as well, but in the chat box. So I'll go ahead and go to the next one. Jeanette Reyes asked, do the years need to be consecutive for identification?
They do, and in fact, there's the requirement is an annual determination, right? So the state has to collect and make annual determinations. So the answer is yes. And then when you're looking at consecutive prior years, the state has the flexibility to use up to 3 consecutive prior years. So yes, the answer is they have to be consecutive if they're using that flexibility. It also has to show if they're making progress, even though a district has exceeded the risk ratio threshold, if they are in fact making progress, reasonable progress to lower that risk ratio, then those years it has to be in each of those years as well.
That kind of feeds into the next question. Is reasonableness defined?
So it's not defined, and the regs really do provide the sufficient flexibility for states to address the demographics and the unique circumstances of their populations. But again, the regs laid out what they believe are presumptive, right? Like, it's not definitive. It's not, if you don't use these, this means you're not reasonable. But the regulations do in fact lay out what the department would in fact consider as reasonable across each of those areas of flexibility where reasonableness is allowed.
People are liking what you're saying, because we also have a question here if they can get a copy of what you're actually saying. And so I would suggest that either the recording would probably be the best way to have that information.
I would also just like to note, right, that what I'm talking about, right, again, I just want to make this pretty clear, right? I'm no longer with the Department of Education. So all of this information that I'm presenting to you is available. I'm just trying to kind of synthesize it for you. But this information is literally straight out of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, as well as the Analysis and Comments section of the final rules.
And we'll provide links to all of that in the chat here as we continue going.
Great.
Let's see. I think there is a couple more questions, and we have plenty of time. We're actually doing great on time, so if we can go ahead and do this. We also have a question from Barbara. Which students with disabilities does CEIS now apply to? Have there been changes with?
So we're going to talk about that a little bit in the remedies section. There's a distinction between comprehensive CEIS as well as just the voluntary CEIS that districts can use their IDA funds to support. But they would, ultimately, when I don't want to, bury my lead or steal my own thunder, because I'm going to talk about it shortly.
Okay.
But part of the effort here was to make sure that we have comprehensive coordinated early intervening services that really apply to children with and without disabilities. So it really is, in fact, the universe of kids in the building.
And I believe you addressed this with the in size, because someone asked as well too about like a one-room schoolhouse. How about their one-room schoolhouse with K through 8 with 30 kids? How is that?
Yeah, again, right, like the flexibility that states have in setting those thresholds and setting those cell sizes and sizes really were designed to recognize there are districts that have very, very small student populations, or even exceedingly large student disability populations. But again, this is not an attempt to label someone as a bad actor, right? Like, if there is in fact significant disproportionality, then what are the policies and practices and procedures in place to address it? It's really to have again, this is about having a fair and meaningful look at the data, bringing in your stakeholders from the state advisory panel and others to really come together and say, all right, what? As we went through the polling and some of the examples before, states really weren't providing district stakeholders children with disabilities with a meaningful assessment of whether significant disproportionality was happening. So this is really about transparency and the opportunity to have hard. This is hard. There's nothing easy about this. Not only is this complicated, but I meant, like, we're talking about race and ethnicity and disability. We're talking about we're having hard conversations, but we can't really begin to address those disparities, those inequities, if we're not honestly, meaningfully looking at the data. And that's really the intent here.
Let's take one last question right now, and then we will move on to this next session and address any others. Last one from Jeanette said, can you briefly explain how the cell size and end sizes were determined?
Oh God, you're going to push me to my. I am not a researcher. Yeah. I'm not a data person. I could attempt to do it, but I'm really reluctant to do it because I don't want to give you information that is my best guess. My best answer to you is I can tell you one thing for sure, that the department spent a lot of energy. I'm talking literally, years of review and analysis to look at the research, to look at data, what are the appropriate cell sizes and end sizes, but really also looked at state practices and came up with what they believed really made sense within the context of state practice and research and data, and that's how they ultimately made those determinations. I can assure you those were some of the most difficult conversations while I was there and happened after I left the department.
Great, thank you so much for answering those questions. And as they come up, we have another pause later on, so.
Okay. All right, shall we move on?
Yes, yeah, let's go for it.
Let's do it. Buckets two of the regs. So again, the first one was the standard methodology. This one is really about the application of disciplinary removals. Under the statute, right, when a state finds significant disproportionality based on race or ethnicity with respect to identification or placement, IDEA and its implementing regs require a set of remedies intended to address the significant disproportionality. Accordingly, the state must provide for the review and, if appropriate, revision of policies, practices, and procedures to ensure that they comply with the requirements of IDEA. Require any LEA identified with significant disproportionality to reserve 15% of their funds to provide comprehensive CIS to serve children in the district, particularly but not exclusively children in those groups that were significantly over-identified, and require the district to publicly report on the revision of policies, practices, and procedures. When Congress added in the 2004 reauthorization, when they added discipline to the significant disproportionality provisions in the statute, it did not make the corresponding change to the provisions regarding the remedies. In other words, although states are required under the law to collect and examine data to determine if significant disproportionality is occurring with respect to the incidence, duration, and type of disciplinary actions in their state and their districts, the required actions to remedy the significant disproportionality are not explicitly applied if a state determines that there is significant disproportionality with respect to disciplinary actions. So there's some vagueness here, there's some ambiguity here. The department has long held, it's been a long-standing policy that disciplinary actions are generally considered removals of the student from his or her placement for varying lengths of time and may constitute a change in placement under certain circumstances. That's the department's long-standing policy, right? The department has therefore previously taken the position that the required remedies apply when there is significant disproportionality in identification, placement, or any type of disciplinary removal from placement. It's important to note that the department has the authority to resolve statutory ambiguity and incorporate into the regs its long-standing interpretation. So accordingly, the regs clarify that states must address significant disproportionality in the incidence, duration, and type of disciplinary actions for children with disabilities, including suspensions and expulsions, just as they address significant disproportionality in the identification and placement of children with disabilities, by ensuring the review of, and if necessary, the revision of and reporting on LEA's policies, practices, and procedures, and by setting aside 15% of its IDA funds to provide comprehensive CEIS. So that's the second bucket, again, applying the disciplinary actions to the remedies of significant disproportionality. Again, we'll have some chance that, maybe that was kind of a short break. Why don't we keep going? But if you have some questions, get them out there, start thinking about them, because we will definitely have some time to do that. So the third bucket is, again, these are my buckets. The third bucket is around the regs is really about the required remedies and the changes that the regs made to the required remedies. And essentially, that is including age 3 through grade 12 with and without disabilities. So under IDEA, every year, a state is required to collect and examine data to determine whether significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and the districts in the state. The review of policies, practices, and procedures must be conducted in every year in which an LEA is identified as having significant disproportionality. As the review and determinations occur annually, each year an LEA is identified as having significant disproportionality represents a separate determination and therefore triggers the remedial requirements. Accordingly, the regs clarify that the requirements of the annual review of an LEA's policies, practices, and procedures in the case of a determination of significant disproportionality. So in addition to the annual review and revision of policies as appropriate, the regs address the comprehensive coordinated early intervening services. So what the regs do essentially is expand the population of children who can be served with IDA Part B funds reserved for comprehensive CEIS to include children with disabilities and children ages 3 through 5, again, with and without disabilities. The proposal to change the interpretation was based on a careful review of the statutory language and the legislative history of significant disproportionality provisions in IDEA. So I'm going to get a little bit technical here, so bear with me as I do, but I want to kind of make sure folks have the opportunity to understand what this is about. So under IDEA Section 613F, an LEA may voluntarily reserve, again, 613F says that a district may voluntarily reserve up to 15% of its IDA Part B funds to provide coordinated early intervening services to students in kindergarten through 12 who have not been identified as needing special ed or related services, but who need additional academic and behavioral supports to succeed in the general ed environment. However, in a case of a determination of significant disproportionality, under Section 618D of the statute, again, this is a different provision, a different set of provisions under the statute. 618D, which is the remedial, the section about remedies under significant disproportionality, requires a district to reserve 15% to provide comprehensive CEIS to serve children in the district, particularly children in those groups that were significantly over-identified. So Congress did not define comprehensive, nor did it explain how comprehensive CEIS in one section, the 618 section, actually differs from the CEIS, which is the voluntary coordinated early intervening services in the different section 613 of the statute. Congress's inclusion of the term comprehensive in one provision and not the other creates an ambiguity. And again, therefore, the department has the authority to interpret ambiguities and interpret the term comprehensive CEIS. This interpretation is reasonable given the purpose of the statutory remedy. Before the change in regs, states could not use IDEA funds reserved for comprehensive CEIS to provide services to children with disabilities, even if they were in the groups with significant disproportionality in identification, placement, and disciplinary removal. In other words, before the change, it was difficult for the very children whose significant disproportionality gives rise to the requirement to provide comprehensive CEIS to actually benefit from the early intervening services themselves. The goal here is to improve comprehensive CEIS as a remedy for significant disproportionality. For example, providing comprehensive CEIS to preschool children so again, we made the changes to address children in grades children 3 through 5 as well, right? And again, this is to improve the use of comprehensive CIS as a remedy for significant disproportionality. So, for example, providing comprehensive CIS to preschool children may help districts to address significant disproportionality in identification by allowing funds to be used to implement universal screening and provide more timely supports to younger children. This could help ensure that children with disabilities and delays are appropriately identified before they enter kindergarten. So again, in addition, the regs expand comprehensive CIS to children with disabilities as well as children without disabilities. This change is more likely to address significant disproportionality in placement and discipline. Again, that's really important, right? Like allowing the CEISLs to be used, comprehensive CEISLs to be used to support children with and without disabilities is really important when we're trying to address disproportionality in placement and discipline by allowing districts to directly improve the supplementary aids and services and positive behavior interventions and supports provided to children with disabilities. So, for example, if districts can use IDA Part B funds reserved for comprehensive CIS to implement a school-wide program to address problems in discipline and serve children both with and without disabilities, significant disproportionality in discipline may be reduced or eliminated. Or the district may use its IDA funds reserved for comprehensive CIS to provide a targeted array of services and support, including professional development and educational behavioral evaluation services and supports in both the general and special ed populations. So I want to talk a little bit about factors and the contributing factors. So the flexibility under these regs underscore the importance of allowing a district to determine which factors contribute to a determination of significant disproportionality and how to effectively target those precious IDA Part B funds reserved for comprehensive CIS to address those factors. Implementing comprehensive CIS, the regs require a district to identify and address factors contributing to the significant disproportionality. These factors may include, among other identified factors, a lack of access to scientifically based instruction, economic, cultural, or linguistic barriers to appropriate identification or placement in particular educational settings, inappropriate use of disciplinary removals, lack of access to appropriate diagnostic screenings, how differences in academic achievement levels might contribute to significant disproportionality in identification, and policies, practices, or procedures that contribute to the significant disproportionality. The LEA must address a policy, practice, or procedure it identifies as contributing to the significant disproportionality, including a policy, practice, or procedure that results in a failure to identify or the inappropriate identification of a racial or ethnic group. So, remember we started, I talked that there were three things I wanted to know. What is the nature of the problem? The second part was how the regs begin to address them. And really what is, the third thing I really wanted to talk about is the benefits of the response to the problem, right? Like how do these regs, how does the department expect the regs to address the problems? So the department anticipates a number of really important benefits from these regs. For example, requiring states to establish and adopt a standard methodology to identify significant disproportionality in the state and the districts in the state will provide clarity to the public. It will increase comparability of data across states. It'll help stakeholders analyze data and advocate on behalf of children with disabilities. It will enhance the overall level of transparency regarding the appropriateness of state-level policies, practices, and procedures as they relate to the identification, placement, and discipline of children with disabilities in the district. These regs will also provide stakeholders, including state advisory panels, an opportunity and an incentive to thoughtfully examine existing state policies and ensure that they appropriately identify LEAs with significant and ongoing disparities in the identification of children with disabilities, their placements in particular educational settings, and their disciplinary removals. And I want to just take one quick second. I'm going to show you this. Again, I didn't show you, but this is, I mentioned this earlier. I don't know if folks can see this, I apologize. But this is the model state timeline that the department, that OSEP has on its website. And essentially what it says in this period of time, starting in this spring of 2017, is in fact the time where where states should be reviewing and analyzing state significant disproportionality, their data, to inform stakeholders. So this is the time when they should be beginning their review, so that during the summer of this year, 2017, they can really begin meeting with those stakeholders, meeting with those state advisory panels to develop those risk ratio thresholds and set those N sizes and cell sizes and the standards for reasonable progress and the like. By clarifying the remedies that apply to disciplinary removals, these regs may help LEAs identify and address the cause of inappropriate removals from the classroom, thereby increasing the number of children participating in the general ed curriculum on a regular and sustained basis. Again, by clarifying, this was such an important piece of it, by clarifying that the remedies apply to disciplinary removals. These regs will help districts identify and address the causes of inappropriate removals from the classroom. Kids can't learn if they're not in the classroom, right? And so hopefully this will take a pretty significant step forward, increasing the number of children who do in fact participate in the general ed curriculum on a regular and a sustained basis. And by clarifying that comprehensive CIS can also be used to support children with disabilities and children ages 3 through 5, the final regs will allow districts to direct resources in a more purposeful and impactful way to improve outcomes for those children in subgroups that have been most affected by significant disproportionality. So, I'm done. I did a lot of talking. I'm sure you're all quite done with hearing my voice, but you know, I hope this was informative for you. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I know I think we have some time to do that, but I really want to press upon you. I don't work for the Department of Ed anymore, so it's really important that you do reach out to your state contact at OSEP, check out the website, and really get the information from them as you begin this really important work. But you see, here's my contact information. This is my email, my direct email, and I look forward to having more conversations with you about this really important set of issues.
Along with that caveat, those links that I provided, the IDC Center is the one who's providing the states with their technical assistance support, so there's a lot of resources there. I also linked directly to them for regulations, and we'll be sending that out along with the archives of this webinar as a follow-up. So you'll have all those resources available to you. We do have another question. We have a couple more questions in chat.
Sure.
We'll do that first. Let's see, the first one. So how might we encourage use of general education funds for interventions to prevent going into disproportionality and having to take the 15% for CEIS from special ed funds?
That's a great question. That's the I want to say that's the big question, but that's the right question, right? Like, students with disabilities are general ed students first, right? And how do we get general education to own kids with disabilities? How do we get general education to take a longer view of resources, right? Like how we use our resources. We've got a good body of research, decades of research that shows that when you provide early intervening services, whether they're in Part C, or the 619 preschool services. But when you provide children with those early intervention services and supports as appropriate, benefits accrue. They don't remove a disability, but they may provide an impact on a child with disabilities' ability to succeed in school and perform in academics. For children with delays, it's certainly appropriate and an appropriate use of general ed dollars to address those delays and provide those early interventions up front to mitigate those delays and maybe even remove those delays. So that's a good question, right? And I don't have an answer for it except like this is just a really, really good use of your funds, right? At the end of the day, it's a really good use of general ed funds to provide, early intervening services up front.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have one more question at this point. Do you have a reference list by chance for the data shared on slides 8 through 14? I believe those are the slides regarding the overrepresentation of children of color and special ed, so the breakdown of the American Indian, the Black children twice as likely identified with intellectual disability.
Yeah, I mean, again, like all of the information that I provided, I don't know if there's a concise kind of listing of those data points. I don't know that if there is or not. There may be, very well may be. But again, all of this information, like honestly, like hopefully 100% of what I said, I pulled from the notice of proposed rulemaking and the analysis and comments on the final regs.
Okay. And then it looks like we have a question from Jeanette as well. Right, how would you gauge the level of support from the current Secretary of Education on these regulations?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, honestly. I don't. I'm not in communication with folks at the department. I was prohibited by law for a year. The law actually requires that I not communicate with the department for a year. So I'm not communicating with the department. So honestly, your guess, your analysis is as good as mine.
Thank you. So we do have more time.
That being said, if I can take a minute of advocacy, right? Like let me back up, right? Like I'll be completely frank with all of you here, right? This administration and this Congress took some controversial steps in overturning and repealing a set of regulations that were issued, final regulations that were issued to the Department of Education. They did not do so here. I'm not privy to the conversations or the discussions that led to that, but again, they could have. They did in the ESSA accountability regs, and they did in a couple of other instances, the Department of Education's regulations around higher education, teacher preparation, but they did not here, and they could have. So hopefully that's a good signal, right? It's also worth noting, right, like they've come out with guidance, right? There's some Q&As that the department recently issued, so I'm assuming, they want to provide support to districts to do this robustly and meaningfully. Based on the evidence that I see, that's certainly my best guess.
Okay. So there is still time for more questions if people would like to add more in chat. We, again, still have Michael, and he's not going away quite yet. I did want to, while people are giving a little moment to think about that, as Jen mentioned, we are going to provide a follow-up email that will have more information, some of the archived links for this webinar and the different links that were provided for assistance. And we do know that some of you that are with us are actually folks that received the invitation via a forwarded email, or perhaps you just got it today and didn't actually register with your email address. And if that's the case, we don't have your email address to do the follow-up email, so please go ahead and email in chat right now, and we will make sure that you're included in that follow-up notice, okay? Also, if you're with a group, perhaps you registered just for the group, but you would like to receive your own individual follow-up email. So if that's the case as well, please, again, take a moment and provide us with your email address in chat. I see some of you are doing that. That's great. We also don't want you to go away because we are going to send just a quick survey to make sure we get feedback. We do this regularly with our webinars. We'd like to know what's worked and what doesn't and continue to provide better service to you. One thing I also want to emphasize that I know Michael mentioned, the timeline. I want to be clear because I know some of you are with districts that have been identified as significantly disproportionate in this current year, or you're still working on your CEIS plan for a previous year. The changes that he just talked about in the regulations and allowable expenditures are not in effect yet. So I don't want people to get confused about it. This is important information in terms of what's going to happen down the road. And again, looking at that timeline will help you understand when it would take effect. But just want to say that out loud.
Yeah, and in fact, if I could just, add to that, just even reading from this, right, this state model timeline. Again, like I mentioned, this spring, the states should be reviewing and analyzing their data to inform their stakeholder discussions, which they anticipate having over the course of the summer and into the fall. They expect that from this August to December, so through the course of this year, the state revision of policies and procedures will have happened, and according to the guidelines here, the annual determinations, when states will actually make the annual determinations of significant disproportionality using this new methodology, will not take place until March, the spring of 2019. So it's just really important. Yeah.
It looks like we also got additional questions popping up in chat. Is there an alternate calculation or method to address the disproportionality districts that do not meet the minimum in or cell size?
No, there's certainly not a requirement to do that. But if the district, feels that it has a problem with significant disproportionality in identification, placement, or discipline, they always have the opportunity to voluntarily set aside 15% of their IDEA funds to address that significant disproportionality. Again, keeping in mind, they couldn't use those dollars to support kids with disabilities or kids 3 through 5, but there's a good chunk of money to really kind of address the problem. There's certainly nothing in the statutes that in the regs that would, prevent or prohibit a district from taking action on its own.
So Barbara McClung has a question as well, just confirming again that these regulations do not go into effect until early as spring 2019. I believe that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so work has to begin now, certainly, but again, the annual determinations that have to be made, which trigger the remedies, don't actually take place until the spring of 2019. It's also important to note that they are building in, because data systems don't necessarily have this, including the 3 to 5-year-olds in the identification analyses. They actually have an additional year to 2020 to do that. So again, I think this model timeline is really just worth it. It'll take you 5 minutes to review it. It should really provide you with some sufficient guidance.
So those decisions will be made by the California Department of Education. As you mentioned, Michael, that's a model timeline. So
that's right.
That could be what they follow. They certainly could do something different, like earlier if they wanted, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that.
They absolutely could. It's also worth noting, right? Like the expectation is that as early as June of this year, right? The expectation is that state departments of education will really begin that stakeholder outreach. So to the extent that you all want to be engaged and have your be a stakeholder and be a part of those conversations as the state sets its thresholds, as it sets its end sizes and cell sizes and does the work that it needs to do under these new regs, that you're part of that conversation. I think that's critical. I think it's critical that the state actually hears from districts and as they work through this process.
Okay, so we don't see more questions in chat, and I certainly don't want to take more of anybody's time than is necessary. So we will, at this point, put the survey up, the evaluation survey, so you can tell us what worked and what didn't and what you'd like to hear more about in the future from SPP-TAP. We thank everyone for your time in joining us today. And again, you can view this very soon, as often as you want, and share it with others. Michael, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate you being here with us today and putting all of this together. Really incredible information, and as you can tell, a lot of people are very interested in having this. And we see Lisa Stein just put, can you hear us clapping? Isn't that wonderful? So you have applause.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I cannot, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, and Preston,
it's actually hard to do this, right? You know it's hard to do this, right? Because I'm really just kind of talking into my laptop.
Great job. So again, the link for the recording will be included in the follow-up email. So you'll just be able to press on that link and you'll be able to see a recording of this webinar. Later we will actually archive it and it will be captioned and so on and be available on our website, but we want to give it to folks that were on this webinar as soon as possible because we know you don't want to wait until it's completely archived and captioned to see it again. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Everyone have a great day, and you'll see the survey pop up. There's our information. Again, those are on your slides, so you can contact us whenever you like. And then the survey is just a few questions. It should just take you a couple of minutes. It'd be best if you do it now before you get busy with other things. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Michael.
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate everyone's time in talking about this really important set of issues. So thank you.